Yo, welcome back everybody to a brand new video here on the second channel, and we just had a major regionals wrap up with the Stuttgart regionals, and I think it's time to do a top 10 best decks in the format video, as San Antonio is coming up this weekend, and it is supposed to be the largest regional of all time. So I think it's best we dive in and look at what I think are the 10 best decks in the format. Now, I'm going to be honest with you, this list was a little difficult to make, not because there aren't 10 good decks, there are at least like 15 good decks right now, but I do think that the meta is very wide open. In fact, I am going to go on and say I don't think there is a best deck in the format. In fact, the top 3 spots on this list could honestly be swapped with each other in terms of order. So I really don't know if this top 10 list is as accurate as it could be, because the meta is really always changing. There are so many different decks you can play right now, and with how wild and out of control everything is, I do think that a top 10 list is definitely going to be a little a more biased, or at the very least, it's not going to be as accurate as it could be. And I do think that there isn't really a best deck in the format right now. I think there are 3 definitive good decks right now that you can consider to be the top 3 best decks, but there isn't really a deck that stands above everything else as a BDIF, in my opinion. In fact, I would argue that a lot of the spots on this top 10 list, not even the top 3, are potentially, spots that could be arranged and moved around over the course of the week. So, in all honesty, this top 10 list might not be as accurate. If anything, take this list as a 10 best decks in the format right now, as opposed to an actual ranking of every deck of how good it actually is. Because I do think that this list can definitely be changed around as you see fit, and I don't think there's a best deck in the format. With that out of the way, let's get into the top 10 best decks in the format right now, heading in to San Antonio. And at the number 10 spot, I've gone with Double Turbo Mew. Now, I definitely think that Double Turbo Mew is the weaker way to play Mew right now, though it did get the highest placement of all the Mew decks at Stuttgart. It did get top 8, and I am looking at Ethan's list here from top 8 at Stuttgart, playing the Luxray and the Grabbers. Now, Double Turbo Mew is a very strong deck. It has a lot of disruption, which is very good right now, and it has the ability to make it so your opponent just can't play the game, and you just win really quickly because you lock your opponent out of being able to do anything with the combo of Judge Path Grabber and being able to Technoblast for a one-hit KO. The downside of playing this deck is Spiritomb just destroys it, and I think that this deck is very strong, but if Spiritomb sees a little bit more play in San Antonio, we might not see Double Turbo Mew be as good as a pick. I also think it is weaker than Fusion Mew. Now, like I said, this top 10, apart from potentially the top 3, are basically going to be in any order you really want them to be, if I'm going to be honest with you. And Double Turbo Mew could be, it could be a number 5, it could be a number 4, it could be a number 6, it could be a number 7, maybe not a number 10. But I did want to include Double Turbo Mew on this ranking. I think the deck is still very strong, and if you're not running into constant Spiritomb, this deck can be a very hard deck to beat. It does have a decent time into Charizard, as long as you're able to Judge Path Grabber them from being able to set up. You can definitely run Charizard over before they are able to set a Charizard EX up. But yeah, Double Turbo Grabber Mew is a pretty strong deck. There's also the Double Turbo Mew playing the Crushing Hammers. That's another way to play Mew. That is also fairly popular. It doesn't play Luxray, but it does still play the Double Turbo Judge Path engine. It's just playing Crushing Hammers over Grabber and Luxray. But yeah, Double Turbo Mew is definitely strong, but in all honesty, it's just really is how popular is Spiritomb going to be. That's going to be the outlier, but still a very strong deck, and I wanted to put it on at this list. And at number 9 is Snorlax. Now, I definitely think that Snorlax has fallen a little bit since its reign over in Gdansk, where it won the regionals, and there's a lot of hype going for the deck. I think after Stuttgart, Snorlax is definitely, the hype is starting to fall off a little bit, but I still think Snorlax is still a very strong deck right now. It still has decent matchups, and it's a deck that definitely can adapt to what is meta. With the amount of Lost Zone going around right now, it is a little scary for Snorlax, but I do think that Snorlax is still a pretty good archetype right now, and is a deck that can still win games either by people not knowing how to play against it, or the fact that you can just hit good matchups. Like, Snorlax should be able to easily beat Charizard, and with Charizard being one of the most popular and strongest decks right now, it's a very good sign for Snorlax enjoyers. But yeah, Snorlax definitely has to come in on this list. Now, in all honesty, I would probably put this near the bottom of the ranking. Like, definitely, I think like 9 or 8 is a pretty good spot to put Snorlax right now, but the deck is still good. Now, if you're somebody who is worried about Snorlax for San Antonio, yeah, San Antonio is going to be a massive tournament. I honestly wouldn't really expect to see Snorlax at all. In a 2,000-player regional, the odds you play against a Snorlax deck is probably pretty low. Like, I don't think we're going to see that much Snorlax. Even though there's going to be more players, I don't think that many players going to even their first regional are going to play Snorlax. It's not really a good deck to bring to your first regional. It's not really a deck that is probably going to be that popular. It's definitely a deck that you can hit in like day 2, but in day 1, I don't think you're going to hit much Snorlax unless you're like getting griefed into the tie bracket pretty hard. But I definitely think Snorlax is still a deck that is going to exist, but I just don't think it's as strong right now. Though having like a good Charizard matchup is always nice, and having good matchups across the board can be good, but I definitely think that its bad matchups are starting to get a lot stronger right now, like Lost Zone variants and even something like Mew can all give Snorlax a run for its money. But definitely not a bad deck still, and it's still a presence in the meta, in my opinion. I don't know if Snorlax is ever going to fall off a top 10 ranking because its presence is always going to be there, and it's still having pretty consistent and good results regardless. Next up is Entei Iron Valiant. Now, Entei Valiant has also slipped a little bit from its ranking when it came off of a second place finish at LAIC, but the deck is still very powerful and can still be a force to be reckoned with. I still think it's a very strong deck regardless and still warrants itself to be in the top 10. It's still a very strong deck. It still can do a lot of good things with the power of Iron Valiant being able to dog stuff, and with Gardevoir and Lost Zone especially getting a lot more popular right now, it's a pretty good thing for this deck in my opinion. I think the deck is still decent, and it's still a very fast and powerful deck, and I think that's what can draw people to it. And I don't think that it really has the worst matchup spread right now. I think that its Mew matchup can maybe be fixed if you're to play a Spiritomb, or even just having access to being able to like chase the Genesect can be really good. And obviously your Lost Zone matchups might be pretty strong as you're able to easily Yoga Loop the Comfies and stuff. And you obviously have a decent time across the board. Some of your worst matchups will include, though, Rapid Strike. I think with Rapid Strike being a pretty strong deck right now, that is a big scare for this deck. And even Mew. If you're not playing Spiritomb, Mew can be pretty bad. And I definitely think that Miraidon is also a deck that you have to be very cautious of when playing this deck. And even Charizard, to be honest. If Charizard is able to set up against you, it's pretty bad, because this deck can struggle pretty bad against Charizard if they're able to set up against you. But you can make it so they can, obviously, but it is still scary to play against Charizard. But I definitely think Entei Valiant is still a strong archetype, and I wanted to still include it in the top 10. And like I said, this top 10 may not really be in any order, so if you want to say that this deck is not number 8 on the list, you can put it to number 6 or number 7, or maybe you think it's lower on the list. It's really up to you, but I definitely wanted to include it somewhere in the top 10 best decks right now in our format. Next up are the Lost Zone decks. Now, Lost Zone has had a huge resurgence these past couple of weeks, and that's mainly because people have been finding ways to play them that is making the deck even stronger. Of course, the deck that won Stuttgart was literally a Sableye, Cramorant, Radiant Charizard deck, which I think a lot of people weren't really expecting, and even we had more Lost Zone in the top 8. Of course, we had a really cool, super effective Glasses Lost Zone deck in top 8, and of course, we saw Tord reinvent the Lost Zone Palkia deck by adding Giratina and to the deck. So definitely the Lost Zone is on a run right now, and I think Lost Zone is still at a pretty good pace. There's a lot of ways to play the deck right now. I mean, we're seeing stuff like Dragonite, Roaring Moon, Radiant Charizard, even a Lost Zone Charizard EX deck got top 8. So the Lost Zone is still pretty good right now, despite what the naysayers are saying with all the Valiants and the Rapid Strikes and the Iron Hands right now. The deck is still performing pretty good, and it is even winning regionals. Now, Lost Box is definitely a fine play for San Antonio, and I would expect to see a little bit of an uptick in Lost Zone's popularity heading into San Antonio, because it is coming off of regional win, and there's a lot of different versions of the deck right now going around, which is obviously very strong, and is a good thing for all you Lost Box enjoyers. It is scary, though, of course, with the popularity of Iron Hands and Miraidon, and especially with Iron Valiant still being out there and Rapid Strike. It is still scary to play Lost Zone. You just have to kind of dodge those bad matchups, or at the very least just hope that you don't get destroyed by Iron Hands super quickly and you can't come back at that point. That's the scary thing about playing Lost Zone, is just can Iron Hands trade so well against you that you're just unable to come back? And that's going to be the deciding factor of how good a Lost Zone can perform. But Lost Zone is definitely on the rise right now. It's proving that it is coming back into the format in a big way, and we're seeing a lot more Lost Zone perform well at these major regionals. And I think we're going to see the same thing occur in San Antonio, and maybe we'll see even more unique Lost Zone decks at San Antonio. The possibility is there, but we'll have to see. Though, again, with Lost Zone, winning a tournament and getting a little bit more popular with all these different versions coming out of Stuttgart, we might see a little bit more of an uptick in Iron Valiant and even in Rapid Strike, which I think is going to be a very big deal for Lost Box. We'll have to see where that all goes heading into San Antonio. But Lost Box definitely has gone up a few places thanks to its decent performance at Stuttgart. All right, now Fusion Mew I definitely think is the better way to play Mew right now, and that's mainly because the Fusion Energy package does give you a lot more resources to work with, and it lets you have a better matchup spread. Like, Double Turbo Mew is good, and don't get me wrong, I think it's still a strong deck right now, but it has obviously a weaker time into Spiritomb, where Fusion Mew doesn't mind Spiritomb as much because you have the Fusion Energy. You're also better into stuff like Snorlax and Rapid Strike because you have the Fusion Energy to get around Snorlax's ability and Double Gunner, and even Tachyon Bits to a degree. Whereas Double Turbo Mew has a better Charizard and Gardevoir matchup, I would argue, and that's mainly the trade-off, I guess, with playing Fusion Mew. Fusion Mew has a better matchup spread, and I think is better off into the big EX decks right now, but where Double Turbo Mew has a potential easier time in a Charizard because you have the disruption cards like the Crushing Hammers or the Grabbers to help you. And again, I think your Guardy matchup's also not bad either when you have access to cards like Grabber and heavier Judge Path, where the Fusion Mew goes more aggressive, where the Double Turbo build goes a little bit more passive and tries to spam the heavy disruption cards, which helps you against Charizard. And with Charizard and Guardy being both very popular, especially Charizard being really popular for San Antonio, Fusion Mew definitely could be a very risky play. But if you're dodging all the Charizards, I do think that Fusion Mew can be a very good play for San Antonio. We'll have to see. Again, having protection against Spiritomb is nice. Having a better time into some of your more awkward matchups where Double Turbo Mew can struggle is also really good. Again, Snorlax can be difficult to deal with for Double Turbo Mew, but when you have Fusion Energy, you don't mind Snorlax as much. Yeah, I don't know. I think Mew's just a very strong deck right now, and I think that Fusion Mew is the better way to play it, though I think Double Turbo Mew is still good. And like I said, everything below the top 3, you can honestly put in any order you want with how they're ranked. This whole list isn't really in any order, in all honesty, just because there isn't really a definitive best deck in the format, and the meta can definitely keep changing heading into San Antonio. But I think Fusion Mew is still pretty good, and if I'm going to be honest, I definitely think this pick is pretty good near the middle of the list, or in the middle of the list at the very least, right? That's where I think a good place to put Fusion Mew would ultimately be right now. Next up is Rapid Strike. Now, I think Rapid Strike is in a very strong spot in our format. In fact, I would probably put it near the middle to, near the top-ish of this list, because I do think Rapid Strike is actually just that good of a deck. I mean, we saw 2 of them in Stuttgart in the top 8. The deck seems like it has a really good matchup spread right now. I mean, you think about it. It's got a good matchup against Guardy and Lost Box, with Lost Box getting a lot more popular right now, coming off of some pretty good placements this weekend. Rapid Strike seems like a very strong pick. Rapid Strike also is decent in a Charizard when you have access to TM Evolution. Your Miraidon matchup's not terrible because you at least have Rapid Strike Urshifu, and your Iron Valley and Entei matchup's pretty good because you have Rapid Strike Inteleon. I think the big thing that hurts Inteleon is just having some really bad consistency issues. Trust me, playing this deck is fun, but man, can you get some of the most unplayable Brickfest hands you've ever seen in your life while playing this deck. And I think that's the main issue with playing Rapid Strike, is your hands can sometimes be really unplayable. This deck is very awkward and clunky, but when it's not clunky and awkward, it's a very good deck in my opinion. And with having a really good matchup spread right now in our meta, looking at it, it looks like this deck is a great play for San Antonio. We'll have to see where it all goes. So we'll have to see where Rapid Strike goes for San Antonio, but it definitely looks like a pretty strong play with how good its matchup spread. It looks right now with the TM Devos and the Lost Boxes and all that stuff running around. It looks pretty good for Rapid Strike right now, I'm not going to lie. Its bad matchups aren't as bad. I mean, obviously, your Mew matchup's going to be a little shaky, and your Snorlax matchup might be tough too, but overall, I really do think that Rapid Strike is in a great spot right now, and we'll have to see where it goes heading into San Antonio. Now, I don't think it's a coincidence that these 2 decks here are both considered to be very strong when they don't draw like a potato, and Rapid Strike and Giratina are both good examples of decks that seem to be very good in theory, but draw like a potato sometimes. And Tina definitely seems like it has a great matchup spread. For starters, you have a very good Charizard matchup, which I think is one of the main appeals of it. Your Mew matchup isn't terrible either, and I also think that your Guardy matchup isn't bad. A lot of people actually say that Tina beats Guardy a lot of the time, but overall, I think Tina's just fine right now. I think it's a pretty safe-ish play for San Antonio. Its bad matchups aren't really that bad right now, and it doesn't really have that many bad matchups, in all honesty. Your Snorlax matchup's really good. That is one thing you get. I mean, your Snorlax matchup is amazing thanks to Shred. But yeah, Tina is looking pretty good right now in our meta. Now, this is the build here that did get top 8 at Stuttgart, and there are a few different ways to play Tina. The 60's kind of been figured out, or at the very least, we kind of know what the 59, 58 card Giratina list does look like right now. But yeah, Tina's a very strong deck. But again, like Rapid Strike, it can sometimes lose to having some consistency issues and some bricks, but Tina is still a very strong deck right now. And I think Tina and Rapid Strike are both the 2 decks that could be the 4 and 5 on this list objectively, if you want to swap either one in any place. But yeah, Tina, Rapid Strike, pretty good decks, and I think Tina might slightly just edge out Rapid Strike, but both decks are pretty strong. And like I said, if you want to swap each deck, or either deck with, the placement on this list, you can go ahead and do that. But yeah, Tina's really good. It's a very simple, straightforward deck, and it feels like we've already we figured out what the ideal 58 skeleton looks like. You know what I mean? So Tina's pretty good. All right, now that we got all the strong decks out of the way, I'm going to say what I think are the 3 definitive best decks right now are. Now, I don't think there is a best deck in the format, and number 3 to number 1 can be swapped in any way you like, in my opinion. But I did want to talk about what I think are the 3 best decks. Starting things off, we do have Miraidon EX. Miraidon EX is in a very good spot right now. It's a very strong deck with Lost Zone doing a lot better. We can see stuff like Iron Hands be very deadly, and of course, against Guardy, it's really good. Miraidon's worst matchups are going to be stuff like Charizard, which is pretty scary. I also think Rapid Strike can be difficult too, depending on how the matchup plays out. But I think Miraidon is a good spot, and without a doubt, is going to be very popular in San Antonio. There's a lot of people that just play Miraidon. It has one of the biggest like stan armies right now. In all honesty, like I wouldn't be surprised if Miraidon is like the second or the most popular deck in San Antonio. To be honest with you, that's just how strong the deck really is. But yeah, Miraidon is in a very good spot right now. It's a deck that I definitely think you need to respect going into San Antonio, and if you don't test against it and figure out how the matchup plays for you, you're in trouble. Miraidon is another deck though that sometimes can tend to be a little bricky. It does rely very heavily on just drawing the nuts. Like, if there's a deck that draws the nuts, I think Miraidon is the deck that needs to draw the nuts in order to operate. But when it does operate, the deck is insane. I mean, when you're hitting hot off your generators, you're getting Iron Hands off on your first turn of the game, it's a pretty good deck. Now, this is the deck that the list here that got second place at Stuttgart. I do like the inclusion of Judge Path. I think that's still a very strong combo within Miraidon, mainly because it's not hard for Miraidon to abuse Judge and Path, in my opinion, and Judge Path is a very good combo right now in our game, and Miraidon is a deck that really does get to abuse it. But yeah, Miraidon is in a very strong spot in our format right now, and it's definitely, like I said, a deck that you yourself should be respecting going into San Antonio. And like I said, I wouldn't be surprised if it is one of the most popular, if not the most popular deck in San Antonio, because it's a fairly, like, beginner-friendly deck. It's got a very big, like, stan army behind it, and it's a deck that is also very good right now, ironically enough. So all those 3 factors make this deck something that you definitely need to watch out for in San Antonio. While we're not at the point anymore where Gardevoir is considered to be the best deck in the format, it is still one of the best decks in the format. Not the best deck, but one of the better decks in the format right now. But yeah, Gardevoir is a very good deck still, and well, I do think that it's, I guess, not really, I didn't really have like an underperformance at Stuttgart, but it only got top 16, right? So I think the deck is still going to be very popular. It's a deck that a lot of people will play, and well, people are, hopefully going to be good at playing the deck, because this deck can go to time a lot. You can get a lot of ties with it. I mean, ultimately, if you want to avoid Guardy, try to stay out of the tie bracket if you can. But yeah, Gardevoir definitely is still a very good deck. It's got a great matchup spread. I think its Miraidon matchup is winnable if, you get around the Iron Hands quick enough. The Charizard matchup's also pretty favored for Guardy, in my opinion, too. And I think your matchup spread is still just very strong right now. Stuff like Rapid Strike and Iron Valiant can be a little sketchy, and Snorlax can be sketchy if you're not playing Turo or you don't know how to pilot the matchup correctly. So I actually think that Guardy should be fine against Snorlax if you play correctly. But yeah, Gardevoir is still very strong right now and is still one of the top decks in the format. Probably going to be decently popular in San Antonio. I think actually the top 3 decks here are probably going to be the top 3 most popular decks in San Antonio, to be honest, and Guardy definitely is going to be up there for sure. It's a very strong deck, and there's a lot of people that will play it. I actually think a lot of the best players going to San Antonio are probably going to bring Gardevoir, so you want to keep that in mind too. And finally, we have Charizard EX. Now, I think Charizard is without doubt going to be in the discussion of the 3 best decks in the meta right now. Charizard seems to be like it's in a great spot. It's got a great matchup spread. It's very strong, and we're seeing it a lot more than we used to. And that's mainly because I think now we're seeing the most popular way to play it being the Rotom build here. The Rotom build does seem to be the best way to play the Charizard deck right now, the Arvinzard build. And we obviously saw like a Lost Zone Charizard EX deck in top 8 too. But if we're strictly talking like Charizard Pidgey, I think Charizard Pidgey is still the better way to play it. The only rough thing about playing Charizard is you're going to be, your Guardy matchup could be a little shaky, and I guess Snorlax isn't great either. If you're not teching for Snorlax, or even your techs for Snorlax sometimes don't even work. Like, Minior isn't a guaranteed way to beat Snorlax, in my opinion, and I think that Charizard is going to struggle against Snorlax. But in my opinion, at San Antonio, if you're playing Charizard, the odds you get a Snorlax aren't very high, because the more casual player is not going to roll up to San Antonio most likely playing Snorlax. They're going to play Miraidon, or Shenpao, or Roaring Moon, or even Charizard itself. That's the other thing. Charizard is going to be very popular in San Antonio. Keep in mind, it's one of the better decks right now, which does factor into its popularity, but also the fact that it's Charizard. People going to their first ever tournament are going to want to play something like Charizard because Charizard is iconic and popular, and people are going to play it because it's Charizard. I mean, that's literally just fact at this point. But yeah, Charizard's very strong, very popular, and is a deck that you definitely need to respect and look out for going into San Antonio. And it might, be the factor of what does well. Like, if we see Mew underperform, it's mainly because the Mew players hit a bunch of Charizard and potentially got farmed. But yeah, Charizard's very strong, very good, and depending on how you want to approach the list, like whether or not you want to respect Snorlax or not is up to you, or whether you want to tech for Guardy or whatever the case may be, it's really all up to you. But Charizard, like I said, very good deck right now, and really its worst matchups are going to be Snorlax and Lost Tina, and potentially Gardevoir, depending on if Gardevoir can run you over quick enough, because I think Guardy, once again, is still favored against Charizard. But those are your worst matchups. But yeah, Charizard definitely deserves to be in the discussion of the 3 best decks. And like I said, number 1 to 3 can be in any order you want. They're not really in any specific order, so, whether or not you want to put Guardian number 1 or Miraidon number 1 or Charizard number 1 is really up to you. But I think Guardy, Miraidon, and Charizard are the 3 definitive, best decks right now, the 3 most popular, the 3 best decks in the meta, and probably the 3 ones to really beat heading in to San Antonio. But let's take a look at some decks that are not quite in the top 10. All right, here's some honorable mentions before we end off the video. Now, I do think that the meta is very all over the place right now. There are a lot of different possibilities for different decks you can play. And some of the decks I think that are outside of the top 10 include the Cloth deck. Now, ironically enough, Cloth had a pretty good performance in Stuttgart. Now, that could be because of the popularity of the matchups you want to hit, like Miraidon, Charizard, and even Roaring Moon saw a little bit of success in Stuttgart, which is mainly where, you'll see the success for Cloth come from. And Cloth is still, an okay deck. Ironically enough, it would still probably be in, the top 15 decks right now. Shenpao is a deck that has fallen off a lot. I mean, a lot of people consider it to be one of the best decks going into LEIC, and now it has crashed completely outside of the top 10. I would maybe put it at number 13 or something, or maybe 12. The deck is still fine. I actually think we're still going to probably see a little bit more Shenpao in San Antonio, because there are a lot of people that do just main Shenpao right now in America, and I think that is going to obviously be a factor in the deck actually getting day 2, because there were 0 Shenpao in day 2 at Stuttgart, and obviously the deck has fallen off completely and is not in the top 10 anymore, but is still outside of the top 10. And I think we are going to see a little bit more Shenpao do better in San Antonio, because there are a lot of players who are going to San Antonio that play Shenpao religiously. I want to talk about Palkia too. Palkia is ironically a good deck right now, and I wanted to include Palkia outside of the rankings. I think the deck is still a strong deck. Palkia Ice Rider is actually not bad. It does have an iffy Charizard matchup, which is maybe the downside, but I think the deck's actually still pretty good right now. Which Guardian matchup can be 50-50, whether or not you can pull off the Cologne Greninja. But yeah, I definitely wanted to mention Palkia too. And also Roaring Moon, which has finally seen a little bit more success. I mean, it's been seeing a decent bit of success in these European regionals we've had these past couple of weeks, and that's a good sign for all you Roaring Moon enthusiasts. Now, obviously, the best way to play Roaring Moon right now is in the Lost on variants, it seems, but even outside of that, the deck is still doing good in its own little bubble as a turbo deck, and it did get 9th place at Stuttgart, and I did want to mention Roaring Moon real quick. It's also a deck that people might just bring, because it's another deck that is pretty popular right now, and people will play just because, it's popular, and it's a straightforward archetype, very linear, and that's really the thing that holds it back, is just how linear it is. But Roaring Moon, I definitely think could be outside of the top 10, maybe in the top 15 somewhere right now. But yeah, that'll be for me on my top 10 ranking right now for the best decks in the format. Again, like I said, this list wasn't really in any specific order. It was hard to really rank what was the 10 best decks right now, because with how all over the place the meta is. And again, I don't think there is a definitive best deck right now. I'm going to do a tier list video a little bit later this week, or tomorrow or whatever, to give my, more in-depth opinion on each deck and where the rankings really are. But I wanted to start off with a top 10 list. But yeah, that'll be for me. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like. If you're new to the channel, subscribe down below. Help me on the road to reaching 10,000 subscribers. We're on the road to 10K. We are getting very close to 10,000 subs here on the second channel. So if you haven't subbed yet, make sure to subscribe down below. Let me know what you thought of this top 10. Were there any decks I was maybe missing? Let me know. That'll be it for me. Hope you all enjoyed, and bye-bye.